Sunsets on my terms. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Maya had always considered the most unremarkable day of the week. She found it slipped under her apartment door like a secret, cream-colored paper that felt too expensive for bad news. But bad news, she had learned, often came dressed in its finest clothes. Ms. Chun, due to the recent acquisition of Meridian Publishing by Blackstone Media Conglomerate, your position as senior editor has been eliminated effective immediately. Please collect your personal belongings by 5 p.m. today. Sincerely, Human Resources. Maya read it 3 times before the words stopped swimming. 23 years. 23 years of discovering new voices, nurturing manuscripts from rough drafts to bestsellers. And this is how it ended, with a form letter that couldn't even be bothered to spell her first name correctly. She set the letter on her kitchen counter next to the coffee maker that had been threatening to break for months. Another thing she'd been putting off dealing with. The morning sun slanted through her window, casting everything in that particular golden light that made even disappointment look beautiful. Maya had always been susceptible to beauty, which her ex-husband claimed was both her greatest strength and her fatal flaw as an editor. "You fall in love with pretty sentences," David had said during one of their last fights. "Sometimes a book needs to be more than just beautiful." He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. Maya had learned to see beauty in unexpected places, in the awkward honesty of a debut novelist, in the raw grief of a memoir that made her cry in her office, in the precise anger of a social justice essay that changed how she saw the world. She had spent her career fighting for those voices, the ones that might not fit neatly into market categories but had something essential to say. And now someone in a boardroom had decided that essential wasn't profitable enough. Maya poured herself coffee and considered her options. She could update her resume, network with former colleagues, play the game of reinvention that the career counselors were always pushing. At 51, she was young enough to start over but old enough to know that starting over was exhausting. Or she could do what she'd been dreaming about for the past 5 years but never had the courage to attempt. Write the book that had been living in her head, demanding to exist. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Marcus's contact. Her best friend since graduate school, now a successful literary agent, Marcus had been trying to convince her to write for years. "The industry is changing, Maya," he'd said over drinks just last month. "The old gatekeepers are losing their power. Readers are hungry for authentic voices, stories that haven't been focus grouped to death. You have stories worth telling." Maya had always deflected these conversations. She was an editor, she insisted, not a writer. Editors were gardeners who helped other people's flowers bloom. Writers were the ones brave enough to plant seeds in uncertain soil. But maybe courage wasn't about fearlessness. Maybe it was about being afraid and doing it anyway. She dialed Marcus's number. "Maya, shouldn't you be at work arguing with some marketing executive about cover fonts? I got laid off." Silence. Then, "Shit. I'm sorry. How are you holding up?" "I'm surprisingly okay," Maya said, and realized it was true. "Actually, I'm calling because I want to talk to you about that book idea." "The memoir? About your mother?" "No, the other one. The novel." Another pause. "The one you've never told me the plot of, because you claim it's too complicated to explain?" "That's the one." "Maya-chan, are you finally going to write a book?" She looked out her window at the city she called home for 3 decades, at the buildings where thousands of people were probably getting similar letters, facing similar crossroads, making similar decisions about who they wanted to be when their old lives ended. "I think I am," she said. 3 hours later, Maya sat in her former office, packing 23 years of her professional life into cardboard boxes. The walls looked naked without her carefully curated collection of book covers. Debut novels she championed, literary fiction that had won awards, memoirs that had started important conversations. Each cover told a story not just of the book itself, but of the battles she'd fought to get it published, the late nights spent perfecting the prose, the joy of seeing it find its audience. This is bullshit, and you know it. Maya turned to find Jessica, one of the younger editors, standing in her doorway with her arms crossed. Jessica was everything Maya had been when she started: idealistic, fierce, absolutely certain that books could change the world if only you could get them into the right hands. "It's business," Maya said, though the words tasted bitter. "It's cowardice. They're getting rid of everyone who actually cares about literature, and keeping the ones who think books are just content to be optimized for algorithmic discovery." Maya taped up a box of manuscripts, the ones that didn't quite work but had something special, the ones she'd kept meaning to revisit, the ones that represented roads not taken. "What are you going to do?" Jessica's expression softened. "Fight like hell to protect what we can." "But Maya, I'm scared. Without editors like you, what happens to the books that matter but don't fit into neat categories? What happens to the voices that need more than 3 seconds to capture someone's attention?" It was a good question, one that Maya had been wrestling with for years as the industry changed around her. Social media had compressed attention spans. Algorithms favored the familiar over the challenging. Marketing departments wanted books that could be described in a single sentence, preferably one that referenced a successful predecessor. "I don't know," Maya admitted, "but maybe that's not our job to figure out anymore." "What do you mean?" Maya picked up a framed photo from her desk, herself and Marcus at their graduate school graduation, both of them grinning and holding champagne flutes, convinced they were going to revolutionize publishing. They looked impossibly young and impossibly certain that intelligence and good intentions would be enough. "Maybe our job is to write the books we want to see in the world, instead of waiting for someone else to do it." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to try something different." "You're going to write a book." "I'm going to write a book." Jessica grinned, the first genuine smile Maya had seen all day. "What's it about?" Maya paused, her hands stilling on the photo. She'd been carrying this story for so long that it felt strange to speak it aloud, like trying to describe a dream that made perfect sense until you had to use words. It's about a woman who inherits her estranged grandmother's house in a small town in Oregon, and when she arrives to sell it, she discovers that her grandmother was part of a secret network of women who helped other women disappear. Abused wives, daughters fleeing arranged marriages, women who needed to become someone else entirely. But the network is still active, and they think she's there to take over her grandmother's role. Jessica's eyes widened. "Holy shit, Maya. That's not a book, that's a phenomenon. Why haven't you written this already?" "Because I'm terrified I'll ruin it," Maya said simply. "It's been perfect in my head for years. What if I get it down on paper and it's just ordinary? What if you don't get it down on paper and spend the rest of your life wondering what it could have been?" Maya looked around her empty office one last time. Through the window, she could see people walking purposefully down the street, heading to jobs and meetings and lives that made sense to them. She had been one of those people until this morning, secure in her routines and responsibilities. Now she felt unmoored, but also strangely light, like someone had been carrying a heavy bag for so long they'd forgotten it was there until someone lifted it from their shoulders. "I guess there's only one way to find out," she said. 2 weeks later, Maya stood in front of 1247 Prospect Street in Millfield, Oregon, holding a set of keys that felt heavier than they should. The house was exactly as she'd imagined it, a Victorian painted in shades of blue and cream, with a wraparound porch and gardens that had been lovingly maintained until recently. Now the flower beds were overgrown, roses climbing wild over the porch railings, giving the place an air of beautiful abandonment. She hadn't spoken to her grandmother Eleanor in 15 years, not since the fight that had split their family down the middle. Maya's mother had called Eleanor dangerous, unpredictable, a woman who filled young girls' heads with unrealistic ideas about independence and self-determination. Maya had been 25 then, caught between loyalty to her mother and fascination with her grandmother's stories about traveling the world, starting businesses, living life on her own terms. The fight had been about Maya's engagement to David, though like most family fights, it had really been about everything else, different generations' ideas about what a woman's life should look like, about safety versus adventure, about the price of choosing yourself over others' expectations. Eleanor had died 6 months ago. Maya learned about it from a lawyer's letter, along with the news that she'd inherited not just the house, but everything in it. Her mother had been furious. "She's manipulating you even from the grave," her mother had said. "She wants to drag you into whatever crazy scheme she was involved in." Maya had planned to sell the house sight unseen. She didn't need the complication of dealing with her grandmother's belongings, the memories, the guilt. But something had stopped her from signing the realtor's paperwork. Maybe it was losing her job, or the way Jessica had talked about fighting for what mattered, or simply the realization that she'd spent too many years taking the safe path. So here she was, key in hand, about to enter a house that felt more like a portal to a different version of her life. The front door opened to reveal hardwood floors covered in worn Persian rugs, walls lined with overstuffed bookshelves, and the kind of comfortable clutter that suggested someone who cared more about living than appearances. The air smelled like old books and lavender, with an underlying scent Maya couldn't identify, something green and wild, like herbs growing in secret places. Maya walked through the room slowly, noting the details that brought back memories she tried to forget. The kitchen table where Eleanor had taught her to make bread during summer visits. The window seat in the living room where her grandmother used to sit with her morning coffee, reading novels and occasionally laughing out loud at something the author had written. The bedroom upstairs that had been Maya's during those magical summers when she was 12 and 13, and thought her grandmother was the most sophisticated person in the world. It was in Eleanor's study that Maya found the first clue that her inheritance was more complicated than she'd imagined. The desk was an antique roll-top that Maya remembered admiring as a child. Eleanor had always kept it locked, claiming it was full of boring financial papers that would only interest accountants. But the key was there now, tucked under a stack of books as if waiting for Maya to find it. Inside were files, dozens of them, organized by year and labeled with women's names. Maya pulled out a folder at random, Sarah M., 2018, and found herself looking at what appeared to be identity documents, a driver's license, social security card, birth certificate, all bearing the same photograph but different names. Sarah Montgomery became Sarah Martinez became Sarah McKay, each identity carefully documented with addresses, employment histories, even family photos that showed the same woman with different hair colors, different clothes, different expressions that transformed her completely. Maya's hand shook as she opened another file, then another. Each one told the same story, women who had needed to disappear, and someone who had helped them do it. Her grandmother hadn't just been an eccentric old woman who traveled the world and flouted social conventions. She had been part of something larger, something that required the kind of careful planning and absolute secrecy that Maya was only beginning to understand. Maya was so absorbed in the files that she didn't hear the footsteps on the porch until someone knocked on the front door. 3 sharp raps followed by 2 softer ones, a pattern that felt deliberate. Maya froze. She had told no one she was coming here, had deliberately avoided mentioning her plans to neighbors or friends. The lawyer had assured her that the house had been empty since Eleanor's death, that there were no complications with the estate. The knock came again. Same pattern. Maya closed the files and walked to the front window, peering through the lace curtains to see a woman about her own age standing on the porch. She had short silver hair and wore jeans with a flannel shirt, but there was something about her posture, alert, watchful, that suggested she was more than a casual visitor. Maya opened the door halfway, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "You must be Maya. I'm Ruth. I worked with your grandmother." "Worked with her?" Doing what? The same thing she did. The same thing she hoped you might do. Ruth glanced around as if checking to see if anyone was watching. May I come in? There are things you need to know about Eleanor's work. And about why she left the house to you. Maya hesitated. Everything logical told her to say no, to send this stranger away, to sell the house and return to her safe, predictable life in the city. But she thought about Eleanor's files, about all those women who had needed new identities, new lives, new chances. She thought about Jessica's question. What happens to the voices that need more than 3 seconds to capture someone's attention? Maybe some stories could only be understood by living them. Maya unlatched the chain and opened the door. Ruth moved through Eleanor's house with the familiarity of someone who had been there many times before. She went straight to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and began opening cabinets as if she knew exactly where everything was kept. Eleanor always said the most important conversations happened over tea, Ruth explained, pulling out 2 mismatched mugs that Maya remembered from childhood visits. She claimed it was impossible to lie effectively while drinking something that required you to sit still and pay attention. How well did you know my grandmother? Maya asked, settling into one of the kitchen chairs that had probably been antiques when she was born. Well enough to know that she talked about you constantly, and not well enough to understand why she cut you out of her life for 15 years. Ruth measured loose tea into a strainer with practiced efficiency. She regretted that fight, Maya. More than you know. Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced at Eleanor's funeral. Grief complicated by anger, love tangled up with hurt. If she regretted it, she could have reached out. She knew where I lived. Could she have? Really? Ruth turned to face Maya, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed. Think about what you knew of Eleanor when you were 25. What would you have done if she'd shown up at your door talking about networks of women helping other women disappear? If she tried to explain that she spent her time creating new identities for women fleeing dangerous situations? Maya considered this. At 25, she had been focused on building her career, proving herself in a competitive industry, planning a wedding to a man who represented stability and conventional success. Eleanor's stories about adventure and independence had seemed charming but impractical, the romanticized memories of someone who had never had to worry about things like health insurance and retirement planning. I would have thought she'd lost her mind, Maya admitted. Exactly. And Eleanor knew that. She also knew that some knowledge is dangerous if you're not ready for it. Ruth poured hot water over the tea, and the kitchen filled with the scent of chamomile and something else Maya couldn't identify. She was protecting you. From what? From having to choose between the life you wanted and the life she needed you to want. The tea was ready, and Ruth carried both mugs to the table, settling into the chair across from Maya. She looked tired, Maya realized, in the way that suggested long-term stress rather than simple fatigue. The network Eleanor was part of has been operating for almost 40 years, Ruth began. It started in the early 80s, when a group of women in Portland realized that the existing systems for helping domestic violence survivors were inadequate. Shelters were underfunded and overcrowded, legal protections were limited, and some women needed more than temporary safety. They needed to disappear completely. Maya thought about the files she'd found, all those different identities for the same faces. That's illegal. So is murder, but we've prevented quite a few of those over the years. Ruth's voice was matter of fact, but Maya caught the steel underneath. We help women who have exhausted legal options. Women whose abusers have resources, connections, the kind of power that makes conventional escape routes ineffective. We give them new names, new histories, new lives. How many women? Eleanor personally helped over 200 women disappear in the past 30 years. The network as a whole, thousands. Maya felt dizzy. Her eccentric grandmother, the woman who sent postcards from exotic locations, and showed up to family dinners with stories about starting businesses in countries Maya couldn't pronounce, had been running a sophisticated operation that existed entirely outside legal channels. "Why me?" Maya asked. "I'm not qualified for this. I don't know anything about identity theft or document forgery or—" "You know about stories," Ruth interrupted. "You know about helping people find their voices. You understand that sometimes the most important truths are the ones that don't fit into conventional narratives." Maya stared at her tea, watching steam rise from the surface. She thought about all the manuscripts she'd edited over the years, the memoirs of women who had survived impossible situations, the novels that explored themes of reinvention and resilience. She had spent her career helping other people tell stories about transformation. "The network is in trouble," Ruth continued. "3 of our most experienced coordinators have died in the past 2 years. Eleanor was our expert on documentation. She had connections, resources, skills that took decades to develop. We're struggling to help women who desperately need our services. There must be other people. There are other people with the technical skills. But Eleanor always said that the most important qualification was understanding why the work mattered. She said you had that understanding, even if you didn't know it yet." Maya remembered the fight with Eleanor 15 years ago, the harsh words that had ended their relationship. Her grandmother had accused her of choosing safety over authenticity, of building a life designed to meet other people's expectations rather than her own. Maya had been furious, had accused Eleanor of being selfish and irresponsible, of prioritizing adventure over commitment. But maybe Eleanor had seen something Maya was only beginning to understand about herself, that she had spent years editing other people's stories because she was afraid to write her own. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Ruth smiled for the first time since arriving. "What Eleanor hoped you'd do. Learn the work. Take over her role in the network. Help women who have run out of other options. And if I say no, then you say no. The network will continue without Eleanor's expertise, though it will be more limited in what we can offer. Some women who might have been helped will have to find other solutions, or live with situations that shouldn't be survivable." Ruth's words hung in the air between them. Maya thought about the files upstairs, all those women who had needed to become someone else entirely. She thought about her own life, how she had spent decades helping other people's stories find their audience while her own story remained unwritten. She thought about Jessica's question. What happens to the voices that need more than 3 seconds to capture someone's attention? Maybe some voices could only be heard if someone was willing to listen in the margins, outside the conventional channels, in the spaces where official systems failed. "I need time to think," Maya said finally. Ruth nodded. "Eleanor said you'd say that. She also said to tell you that thinking was fine, but that some decisions could only be made by doing." She stood to leave, pausing at the door. "There's a woman coming to town tomorrow. Her name is Angela, and she's been traveling for 6 weeks, staying ahead of someone who shouldn't be able to find her, but somehow keeps getting close. Eleanor was supposed to help her disappear permanently." Ruth handed Maya a piece of paper with a phone number written in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. "Angela will call this number tomorrow at noon. She's expecting Eleanor to answer. If you're not ready to help her, I understand. But she's running out of places to hide, and we don't have anyone else with Eleanor's expertise available." Maya looked at the phone number, thinking about a woman she'd never met who was running from something terrible enough to require complete reinvention. "How do you know I won't turn you in?" she asked. "Report the network to authorities?" Ruth smiled again, but this time it was warmer, tinged with something that looked like pride. "Because you're Eleanor's granddaughter. And Eleanor always said you had the most important qualification of all, which is, you understand that some rules are less important than some people." After Ruth left, Maya sat in the kitchen until long after dark, thinking about stories and voices and the different kinds of courage required to help people find their way to new lives. She thought about all the manuscripts she'd worked on over the years, the ones that had stayed with her because they dared to imagine that people could transform themselves, that identity was less fixed than most people believed. She thought about Angela somewhere out there waiting for help that might not come. And she thought about Eleanor's files, filled with evidence that transformation was not just possible but necessary. That sometimes the most radical act was helping someone discover who they could become instead of resigning them to who they'd always been. Maya pulled out her phone and called Marcus. "How's the book coming?" he asked without preamble. "It's becoming more complicated than I expected," Maya said. "Marcus, do you remember what you said about readers being hungry for authentic voices?" "Of course. Why?" Maya looked around Eleanor's kitchen, at the herbs growing in coffee cans on the windowsill, at the bulletin board covered with notes in her grandmother's handwriting, at the evidence of a life lived entirely on its own terms. "I think I'm beginning to understand what that means." Maya spent the night reading through Eleanor's files, trying to understand the scope and complexity of the network her grandmother had been part of. Each folder told a story of careful planning and meticulous attention to detail. Eleanor hadn't just been creating false documents. She had been crafting complete new histories for women who needed them. Sarah Montgomery, who had become Sarah McKay, had been fleeing a husband who had connections in law enforcement and a history of finding women who tried to leave him. Eleanor's notes tracked Sarah's transformation over 18 months. New job training as a dental hygienist, carefully constructed employment history, even staged photographs to document a childhood that had never happened but needed to exist on paper. Maria Santos, now living as Michelle Stewart, had been trapped in an arranged marriage to a man who had threatened to kill her family if she tried to escape. Eleanor had worked with contacts in 3 different states to create not just a new identity but an entirely new support network. References who would vouch for Michelle's character, former employers who would confirm her work history, even a fabricated college transcript from a school that had mysteriously lost its records in a convenient fire. The attention to detail was staggering, but what struck Maya most was the care evident in Eleanor's notes. These weren't just transactions or technical challenges, they were relationships. Eleanor had stayed in touch with many of the women she'd helped, tracking their progress, celebrating their successes, providing ongoing support as they built their new lives. Maya found Christmas cards from Sarah/Michelle, now married to a veterinarian in Montana and working at an animal shelter. There were photos from Maria/Michelle's graduation from nursing school, letters from women who had gone on to start businesses, raise children, find love with people who saw them as they wanted to be seen rather than as their circumstances had defined them. Eleanor had been more than a forger or document specialist. She had been a midwife for new lives, helping women birth versions of themselves that could survive and thrive. The phone rang at exactly noon. Maya stared at it for 3 rings before answering, her heart hammering. "Hello, Eleanor." The voice was young, scared, carefully controlled. "No," Maya said gently. "Eleanor died 6 months ago. My name is Maya. I'm her granddaughter." Silence. Then, oh God, what am I going to do? Are you Angela?" "Yes. Eleanor was supposed to. She said she could help me disappear. I've been traveling for weeks, staying in different places, but he keeps finding me. I don't know how, but he always knows where I am." Maya closed her eyes, thinking about Ruth's words the night before. Some decisions could only be made by doing. "Where are you now?" "A motel outside Portland. But I can't stay here. I was supposed to meet Eleanor today, get new documents, become someone else. Without that..." Angela's voice broke. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Maya looked around Eleanor's study, at the carefully organized files, at the evidence of 40 years of women who had needed to disappear and found someone willing to help them do it. "Come to Millfield," she heard herself say. 1247 Prospect Street. "I'll help you." "You will? But you said you weren't Eleanor." "No, I'm not Eleanor. but I'm willing to try to do what she would have done. Maya gave Angela directions and hung up, then immediately called Ruth. She's coming, Maya said without preamble. Angela, I told her to come here, but I have no idea what I'm doing. Eleanor always said that willingness was more important than expertise, Ruth said. I'll be there in an hour with some of Eleanor's contacts and resources. Maya. Yeah. Welcome to the network. Angela arrived 3 hours later, driving a 10-year-old Honda with mismatched tires and a back seat packed with everything she owned. She was younger than Maya had expected, maybe 30, with dark hair that had been recently dyed from what looked like blonde. She moved carefully, like someone accustomed to checking over her shoulder, to calculating escape routes, to living in a state of constant vigilance. Maya invited her in for tea, following Eleanor's example. It seemed important to create some sense of safety and normalcy before discussing the logistics of disappearing. How long have you been running? Maya asked. 6 months this time, but really it's been 3 years since I left him the first time. Angela wrapped her hands around the mug as if seeking warmth. I tried everything the normal way first. Restraining orders, moving to different states, changing my name legally. Nothing worked. He has money connections. He's convinced that I belong to him. Maya thought about the women in Eleanor's files, the patterns of escalation and pursuit that required more drastic measures than legal systems could provide. What made you contact Eleanor? A woman at a shelter in Denver gave me her number. Said Eleanor helped women who had exhausted legal options. Angela looked around the kitchen, taking in the herbs and the bulletin board and the comfortable clutter. She said Eleanor understood that sometimes you have to choose between being legal and being alive. Ruth arrived as promised, carrying a leather satchel that looked like it had traveled many miles. She introduced herself to Angela with the same matter-of-fact warmth she'd shown Maya, as if helping women disappear was the most natural thing in the world. The first thing we need to understand is how he's been tracking you, Ruth said, settling at the kitchen table. You've been careful about avoiding credit cards, using cash, staying in different places. But he's still finding you. Angela nodded. I thought maybe he had hired a private investigator, but it's more than that. It's like he always knows exactly where I am. Sometimes within hours of when I arrive somewhere new. Ruth and Maya exchanged glances. Maya was beginning to understand that this work required a different kind of thinking than she was used to, less linear, more intuitive, focused on patterns and possibilities that conventional logic might miss. Have you been in touch with anyone from your old life? Ruth asked. Family, friends. Anyone who might be sharing information? No one. I cut off all contact when I left. Phone, new number, bought with cash. Car, bought it used, paid cash, registered under a false name I was already using. Ruth frowned. There's something we're missing. Eleanor always said that the most dangerous assumptions were the ones you didn't know you were making. Maya found herself thinking like an editor, looking for the elements of the story that didn't fit the expected narrative. Angela, what do you do for work? I'm a graphic designer. Freelance. I work online. Computer. Same laptop I've had for 2 years. But I use public Wi-Fi VPNs. I'm careful about digital security. Ruth's expression sharpened. Same laptop from when you were with him? Yes, but I wiped it completely. Reinstalled the operating system. Changed all my passwords. That might not be enough, Ruth said quietly. There are ways to track hardware that survive operating system changes. If he had access to your laptop while you were together. Angela's face went white. He's tech-savvy. He works in software development. He always insisted on helping me with my computer problems. Maya felt a chill as she understood the implications. He's been tracking your laptop this entire time. Which means he knows you're here, Ruth added. Right now. Angela stood up so quickly she knocked over her chair. I have to go. I can't bring this to you, I can't. Sit down, Maya said, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. Running right now won't solve anything. He already knows where you are. But now we know how he's been finding you. Angela remained standing, poised for flight. Maya looked at Ruth, then back at Angela. She thought about all the women in Eleanor's files, the ones who had been helped to safety, who had been given chances to become who they needed to be. We're going to help you disappear, she said. Completely. New identity, new history, new life. But first, we're going to use the fact that he's tracking you. What do you mean? Maya felt something click into place, the same sensation she'd experienced when editing a manuscript, and suddenly seeing how all the pieces could fit together to create something powerful and coherent. We're going to let him think he's found you, she said. And then we're going to make sure he never can again. By evening, Eleanor's kitchen had been transformed into a war room. Ruth had called in 2 other members of the network, Janet, a retired police detective who specialized in digital security, and Maria, not the Maria from the files, but another Maria entirely, who had been creating false documents for the network for over a decade. Angela sat at the center of it all, no longer the frightened woman who had arrived that afternoon, but someone beginning to understand that she had allies who knew how to fight back. The laptop is definitely compromised, Janet confirmed after running a series of diagnostic programs. There's spyware embedded at the firmware level. Expensive, sophisticated stuff that most people wouldn't know how to detect or remove. Can we use it against him? Maya asked. She was thinking like a story editor again, looking for ways to turn what seemed like a weakness into a strength. Janet grinned. Oh, we can definitely use it against him. Question is whether you're prepared for what that might look like. Maya looked around the table at these women who had dedicated themselves to helping others disappear. She thought about her old life, her safe job, her predictable routines. Then she thought about Angela and Sarah McKay, and all the other women who had needed Eleanor's help. What did you have in mind? The plan they developed over the next several hours was more complex than anything Maya could have imagined, but it had an elegant logic that reminded her of the best novels. Multiple storylines that seemed independent, but would eventually converge in a climactic moment that recontextualized everything that had come before. Phase 1 involved allowing Angela's pursuer to think he had cornered her. The laptop would continue transmitting location data, but they would control where that data pointed. Janet had identified several properties within a 2-hour drive that were isolated enough to provide privacy, but accessible enough to seem like reasonable hiding places for someone on the run. We'll move you through 3 different locations over the next week, Ruth explained to Angela. Each one will look like a temporary refuge that you've found and abandoned. Meanwhile, Maria will be working on your new identity documents. Maria spread several folders across the table, each one containing the beginning of a new life. I've got 3 possibilities for you to choose from. Jennifer Walsh, teacher from Oregon; Katie Morrison, nurse from California; or Alex Rivera, social worker from New Mexico. Angela studied the documents, birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses, all bearing her photograph but different names, different histories. How do you create all of this? Very carefully and with a lot of patience, Maria said. The key is building identities that can withstand scrutiny. We don't just create documents, we create lives that make sense. Employment histories, educational backgrounds, references who will vouch for your character and confirm your story. What about phase 2? Maya asked. Janet pulled out a tablet and opened what looked like surveillance footage. While Angela is leading him on a chase through decoy locations, we'll be gathering information about him. The same spyware he used to track her can work in reverse. We can access his communications, his location data, his digital life. Is that legal? Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Absolutely not, Janet said cheerfully. But neither is stalking, harassment, or the kind of sophisticated tracking he's been using. Sometimes you have to choose between being legal and being effective. Maya thought about Ruth's words. Some rules are less important than some people. What's phase 3? Ruth's expression grew serious. Phase 3 is where we make sure he can never find Angela again. Or any other woman for that matter. How? We expose him, Janet said. Document his illegal tracking activities, his harassment, his stalking behavior. Build a case that law enforcement can't ignore, even if he does have connections and resources. But won't that put the network